Hello, everyone, and welcome to yet another episode of the Most Notorious Podcast. I'm Eric Rivenes. Well, Louis Ferrante is back again. I am very pleased to announce. You might remember our interview just under a year ago. He talked quite a bit about his time in prison, how he utilized his time there to educate himself through books, self-study. He wrote a lot while incarcerated and still does now. And he has drawn from his experience working for a crime organization years ago as a young man and incorporated that experience, that firsthand knowledge, into his writing. Our first interview was episode 334 and all about the birth of the Mafia from his book Borgata, Rise of Empire, A History of the American Mafia. And his sequel to that book came out on January 7th. It is called Borgata, Clash of Titans, A History of the American Mafia, Volume 2. So great to have you back to the Most Notorious Podcast. Thank you for coming on.
Thank you for having me, Eric. I'm thrilled to be back.
Yeah. So we talked a lot about the origins of the Mafia back in Sicily in our first interview together and didn't get too far beyond the Mafia as it established its early foothold in New Orleans and then in New York City. This book begins in 1965. Would you mind giving us a bridge, maybe to start with? Tell us a little bit about the evolution of the Mafia from the 1920s through the 1950s.
Sure. So the first volume, Borgata, Rise of Empire, traced their meteoric rise from 1860s Sicily, which I wanted to get to the heart of where it all began, how it all began. And it follows the immigrant wave into the United States, the Italian immigrant wave into the United States, which went on in the late 19th century, early 20th century. And it traces the mafia, how they picked up here in the United States. Mostly Sicilian mafiosos. It began in Sicily, but also Italians from other parts of Italy, Neapolitans, Calabrians. There were other people from other places, and Italy is only Italy to the tourist, as I said in Volume 1. To Italians, it's very, very divided. It's segmented. It's the city-states of Italy went a long way, even after the unification of Italy, where people still felt they came from a certain region. And my own grandparents on my father's side were from Bari, and they married each other. And when they came to the United States, my grandfather wanted to find another gentleman who would marry his sister from Bari. They felt like that was sort of like, and eventually Italians intermarried with each other and with other ethnicities. But in the very beginning, they were very clannish. So my mother's family, for example, my mother's mother was from Sicily and her father was from Naples. And then my cousins married Irish, Germans, everything you could think of across the spectrum. So it changed over time. But in the beginning, the Italians were very clannish, and they did come to America and they picked up with the mafia here. And they rose pretty fast in terms of prosperity with regard to their ability to infiltrate a lot of industries and also able to corrupt a lot of police and politicians. And that was sort of like the impetus behind their meteoric rise. And I traced that in Volume 1 of Borgata, Rise of Empire, exactly how they did it. They capitalized on events that took place. They were very reactive, for example, during Prohibition. They wanted to supply the people, knowing the people would be gracious to anyone who would supply a demand that the government was denying them. And most people did want alcohol. They weren't happy with the government telling them. They felt the government was treating them like children, saying you're not allowed to drink. And people were aggravated and angry about that, and they turned to the mob. Following, at some point or another, the stock market crash when banks clamped down on credit, and a lot of businesses and a lot of different outfits in construction and across the board, so many different areas of industry that the mob infiltrated was because the banks clamped down and no one had money and the mob was willing to lend it. And, with obviously the understanding that they would become part of that business. And a lot of the businesses they infiltrated following the stock market crash, they remain in today, even in my own time. They were still active in those areas of industry. So I traced that all in Volume 1. And then what happens in Volume 2 is the mafia is super established, and I refer to it as an empire, something that Time and Life magazines have done in the past. So I felt like it was okay to refer to it as an empire. And the empire is at its peak, and they've never really encountered any pushback from authorities, any major fierce pushback. Obviously, Senator Estes Kefauver had the Kefauver hearings where he dragged a few mobsters in front of a congressional committee. Thomas Dewey, who started out as a prosecutor, went on to become governor of New York. He had a bit of a crusade that didn't last very long, but he did have a small crusade against the mob where he handpicked a few mobsters and prosecuted them. But it was mostly to make a national name for himself so that he could achieve higher office. He did win the gubernatorial race in New York, and he went on to run as the Republican nominee for president against Franklin Delano Roosevelt and eventually against Truman. That famous headline, if you recall, Truman loses, but he won. That was against Dewey. So there was a lot of I guess upward mobility within the mafia without any real obstacles. And then Bobby Kennedy comes along, and the Kennedys first, the reason why they got into politics, to be ultra clear, is Joe Kennedy Sr. wanted to run for president. He wanted to be president desperately. And he was appointed ambassador to England by Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And he blundered on the eve of war, World War II. The Brits were already at war with Germany. And Joe Kennedy didn't want to get involved with that war. He felt like it was a dangerous thing for the United States. It wouldn't be good for his investments. He could possibly lose children fighting the war. And for a number of reasons, he just didn't want us involved in the war. But he made those statements when England was a close ally of the United States. And the statements, he made them in private and confidence with a couple of reporters who he knew. And one of the reporters for one of the newspapers respected his privacy, and the other one couldn't resist a good scoop. And he ran his derogatory comments with regard to, he said something along the lines of, democracy is finished. It'll be finished in England. If the United States gets involved, it'll be done for them as well. And it ruined him. Any opportunities he might have had to be president, were destroyed. He's a member of the leading democracy in the world. And United States obviously became, quote unquote, the arsenal for the democracies prior to getting involved in the war and even during. So he kind of is knocked out of the race. And then he pushes his son, Joe Jr., he wants him to be president. And Joe Jr. dies very heroically during the war. He was his plane was blown up. He was basically on just about, a lot of people refer to it as a suicide mission. It was a very dangerous mission with chances of survival weren't great, but he was heroic enough to take that chance, and he died. So then he was in the European theater, where Jack Kennedy, the next oldest brother, was in the Asiatic theater, and he was on a PT boat, and he was a war hero. And I make sure I mention this in the beginning of my book because I am hard on him later in the book for a number of things, a number of reasons. But he was a heroic individual. I mean, he had true grit, if ever there was. His boat gets sliced in half. His PT boat with a mahogany hull, I think it was, gets sliced in half by a Japanese, might have been a destroyer with a steel hull. And he literally swims around the burning sea, dragging men to safety, dragging members of his crew to safety. And then when he finally got the survivors together, he was able to swim. They swam long distance to a deserted island, and he literally swam the whole distance, dragging one injured man. So he really, really displayed inarguably true heroism. I mean, the definition of heroism. So he comes home from the war, and his father wants to market that and make the best of it and try to get him in the White House. So at some point, he becomes a congressman and becomes a senator. And now Bobby, his younger brother, he joins the McClellan Committee, and he wants to go after the mob. And he also wants to go after Clark Mullenhoff, who was a journalist, told Bobby, hey, why don't you attack the Teamsters? They're infested with mobsters, and they're as dirty as could be. Go after them. That's going to make a name for you. Grab them in front of them, drag them in front of the committee, and go after the Teamster Union. And the Teamster Union was this sprawling union across the United States, mostly truckers. They started out as like milkmen, and then they grew to be all kinds of delivery men. And at the peak of at the height of their power, when Bobby Kennedy starts to go after them, they literally could call a strike and not only disrupt the U.S. economy, but perhaps just like completely strangle it, overnight. So they were feared. And then to know that the Teamsters could strangle the U.S. economy if they called a strike, because the U.S. economy was so reliant on all the truckers across the United States, and the mobsters were controlling the Teamsters, was really, really not something Bobby felt was good. Rightly so. So he says, hey, I'm going to go after them. This is a danger to the United States. And he called them the enemy within, which was the title of his book, which he wrote following the McClellan Committee hearings, also known as the Rackets Committee, more commonly known as the Rackets Committee, because he explored the rackets. So Bobby goes and he drags not only the leader of the Teamsters in front of Congress and members of the Teamsters throughout the United States, but he's just subpoenaing every mob guy he could get a hold of and dragging them in front of Congress and browbeating them and humiliating them at times. He had a very combative nature, Bobby, unlike Jack Kennedy. I walked away with all of my years of research on Jack. I walked away with a tremendous affinity for Jack Kennedy as a person. I thought he was an incredible human being, did not hold grudges, was very easygoing in his personal life. I know he's been castigated for being a profligate philanderer. I understand that. I know that doesn't fly in today's world. I understand the criticism of him. I sympathize with that criticism. However, as a person, he was very easygoing, very easy natured. He made friends very easily. He was Mr. Make Friends, how to make friends and influence people, whereas Bobby was how to alienate friends and make enemies. That was more so Bobby's nature. Joe Kennedy Sr. once said, Bobby hates like me. He's exactly like me, holds a grudge forever. Another time he said Bobby would be a great Nazi. He'd really be true about it. If he lived in Germany, he would have been really, really a sincere Nazi, because that's the kind of guy he is. He likes to track people down, his enemies, and people he considered his enemies. So Bobby and Jack had two very different personalities. But Bobby insists that Jack come on the committee with him so that they can make a national name for themselves. And Joe Kennedy Sr. says, no, don't do that. Don't do that, Bobby. I don't want you on it, and I don't want Jack on it, because you don't tangle with labor. If you want to get in the White House, the last people you want to create disharmony with is labor, the labor movement. Don't go after the Teamsters. They're the most powerful union in the country. We don't want to mess with labor. We're going to need their votes. Bobby, however, felt, and he fought with his father about this, he felt that alienating the Teamsters wouldn't be that detrimental to Jack's candidacy, because the Teamsters had backed President Eisenhower in 1956 through their president, Dave Beck. Dave Beck endorsed Eisenhower, who was a Republican. And Bobby felt like, well, if they're going to endorse a Republican in 1960, we'll just say, hey, you know what? We don't need their endorsement. They're a bunch of crooks anyway. I think it will work out just fine. And to Bobby's credit, it did work out just fine. They attacked the Teamsters, and Bobby actually took down Dave Beck. He exposed him in Congress and then recommended prosecution. And Dave Beck eventually had to resign. And his seat was filled by a man whose name has become synonymous with the Teamsters, Jimmy Hoffa. And Jimmy Hoffa becomes the new president. But when finally Jimmy Hoffa said, I am not going to endorse the Kennedys, and first he endorsed Lyndon Johnson in the Democratic primary. Johnson eventually lost to Jack Kennedy and became Jack's vice president. And then Hoffa switched over and backed Richard Nixon in the general election. But Hoffa wanted anyone but the Kennedys because he distrusted them. But Jack was able to say, well, we don't need Hoffa's endorsement. He belongs in jail anyway, and that's where he should be. So it actually worked out to exactly the way Bobby imagined it would. The other thing, though, why the mafia, after being harassed by Bobby in the rightly harassed, I should say. They were harassed, though, but they were criminals, and Bobby was trying to expose them. But they felt harassed, and they felt a lot of ire toward Bobby after the hearings. And why they were willing to forgive him was Joe Kennedy had a relationship with the mob for many years. During the era of bootlegging, he worked with a number of mobsters, and the testimony not only came from mobsters, but I went and dug deep and found testimony from Kennedy family members, Kennedy friends, law enforcement officials, prosecutors, people, even a gentleman who Jack Kennedy would eventually appoint to a federal judgeship, even said Joe Kennedy was involved with the mob during bootlegging. So the sources vary, and it's heavily sourced. He was involved to some extent with the mob. And he also had like a B-rate movie company. So he made Hollywood movies for a while, Joe Kennedy Sr. did. And he needed to have a relationship with the mob to make sure that labor relations went smoothly in Hollywood, because the mob could stop you from making a movie at the time. All of the big movie guys had to have some type of friend in the underworld, or just the things, work stops, and the movie cannot be made without them, period. So Joe Kennedy had some type of working relationship with them as far as that was concerned as well. And whatever else may have been, who knows, but there seems to have been some relationship with the mob. There was. So Joe Kennedy says, well, maybe I can convince them that my sons went after the mob, but they're ready to move on. This is, we want the Kennedys in the White House. And once we achieve that goal, we're going to move on to bigger issues like civil rights for African Americans and slowing down the nuclear arms race, keeping the Soviets behind the Iron Curtain, etc. These are things that the progressive movement in the Democratic Party really wanted to push these issues during Kennedy's administration. So that's sort of like the mob was kind of felt like, Governor Dewey, rather prosecutor, District Attorney Dewey, once he was done pretty much convicting us left and right, he made a name for himself. He went on to become a governor, and he ran for president. He'll be done with us as well, just as he was done with us, and Estes Kefauver was done with us at some point and went on to run for president. We believe the Kennedys will. We believe they'll move on. There's no need to chase the mob once you're in the White House. We've never been chased by the president before or the attorney general. So it made sense to them. So they felt like Joe kind of convinced them with the help of his underworld / Kennedy liaison, Frank Sinatra, who was very close with the Kennedy family and also close with many mobsters across the country, mafia dons. They, meaning Joe Kennedy Sr. and Frank Sinatra, convinced the mob that if you help Jack into office, nobody's going to be looking for you guys. We'll have the time of your life for 4 years. And if Jack's in there for 8, you won't have to worry about a thing for 8 years. And they were convinced, and they signed on. Now, the Chicago mob signed on, the New York mob signed on. However, there were 2 Gulf Coast bosses, Santo Trafficante from Florida and Carlos Marcello from Louisiana, who agreed with Jimmy Hoffa of the Teamsters that we can't trust the Kennedys. And those 3 people, those 2 bosses and the Teamster leader, Marcello Trafficante and Hoffa, refused to back the Kennedys. They did not buy into it. However, the rest of the mob, the rest was, 90% of them said, we'll back the Kennedys. We believe it. Frank Sinatra gave us his word. Joe Kennedy Sr. gave us his word. There's no reason for us to doubt that. So there's evidence that I state in the book that the mob dumped a lot of money into the West Virginia primary when Kennedy fought with Hubert Humphrey, and we just pulled it out slightly. So there's a lot of evidence, and there were investigations that were halted into the West Virginia primary. And then also, too, in the general election, the mob was very, very crucial in their role of, they controlled a number of very, very big wards in Chicago. I think it was the 11th ward, the 28th ward, and they made sure that those wards went heavily for Kennedy. And because they controlled Chicago, and they even helped Mayor Daley, who was the big mayor of Chicago at the time, who was also a close friend of Jack Kennedy, because they helped Mayor Daley, and they worked sort of hand in hand with Mayor Daley, and they made sure that Chicago was delivered and Illinois was delivered as a result of Chicago. So Kennedy pulls out the election, and he appoints Robert F. Kennedy as his attorney general. This did not scare the mob at the time. They were like, you know what? That's not a big deal. We understand that Joe is wants Bobby in as attorney general to make sure nobody looks too deeply into election fraud, whether it be in West Virginia or Illinois. So that's fine. That doesn't mean anything for us. No big deal. But Bobby, once he gets into the Oval Office, and let me just say this too, and I make this clear in the book. I'm very nonpartisan. For any of your Democratic listeners or Republican listeners or right or left or independents or libertarians, I want to make sure that mob money was dumped into both parties. The mob has never been partisan. They help whoever they think will help them most. And if both candidates look good, they help both. They may help one a little more than the other. They may not the next time. They judge by what's to their own personal advantage, period. So eventually, Richard Nixon, who ran against Kennedy, may have lost the general election to Kennedy, but there's a lot of evidence that Nixon, in other ways, took money from the mob as well. Lyndon Johnson, who may have lost to Kennedy in the Democratic primary, but went on to become his vice president, also took mob money. And I don't just shoot from the hip. This is all heavily sourced in my book. I urge your listeners to read it, Borgata, Clash of Titans. Take a look at the source notes in the back. It's all heavily sourced. I have to use evidence before I make an allegation. But the mob was controlling, I just want to make it clear, the mob was controlling a lot of politicians in Washington from both parties, from both sides of the aisle. So that said, moving back to speed, they felt that they would not have a problem with Bobby as attorney general. They were promised that the Kennedys were going to move on to bigger social issues and geopolitical issues, and it's okay. Bobby, though, holds a grudge. Recall that at the top of this interview, I mentioned that Joe Kennedy said he hates like me, and he's a grudge holder, Bobby. Different character than John. John's willing to sweep everything under the rug, water under the bridge the next day, no big deal. Bobby was not like that. Bobby would hold a grudge for life. And he felt now, with all of the power he had in his hands as the attorney general in charge of the entire justice system, including the FBI, he was going to make the mob pay for any embarrassment that they caused him during the Rackets Committee when they refused to answer questions, hid behind the Fifth Amendment. He despised them when they hid behind the Fifth Amendment. He did not believe that the Fifth Amendment was put to its proper use when they would hide behind it and exert their right to remain silent. So he would be mad at them then, and he was mad at them now, and he was going to make them pay. So he pulls together all the various agencies under his command, and he pretty much orders them to go after the mob with everything they have. So the mob now, who've had an easy ride since the moment they got to this country, to the United States, they've pretty much had a free pass, been running wild ever since. Couple of stumbling blocks, maybe Estes Kefalva, Governor Dewey, or rather a USDA Dewey, but who went on to become, he was a USDA at one point and also the New York District Attorney. So either title works, but District Attorney Dewey went on to become a governor, but they moved on. Now they've got somebody who doesn't want to move on, and he's coming after them with everything he has. And the prosecutions rise rapidly, and he's indicting mobsters across the country. He's tormenting mob bosses. He's having the FBI. He's insisting that the FBI follow them. And Hoover, who always played this very careful game, Hoover was a wily man, but a smart man. And you may not like him as a person. You may not like him as a leader. And he's caught a lot of slack over the years, a lot of insults from a lot of different authors I read. But he knew how to achieve and hold on to power. And I do believe he was patriotic. He was a patriotic American. And I think that any of the bad things he did, and he did quite a few, and I do not agree with the bad things he did. By no means do I agree with any of the bad things he did. However, I do believe that he had the America's best interests always at the forefront of his mind, just as when Jack Kennedy made blunders during his administration, people were quick at the time to attack Kennedy as pro-communist and And I do not believe any of that. I believe Kennedy was a true American, a patriot. He was a war hero. I believe he always had good intentions. So, I mean, the road, good intentions. What is the saying, Eric? I mean, right? The path to
Right.
heaven is paved with good intentions, or hell rather is paved with good intentions, right? So they did a lot of bad things. Hoover, his FBI. However, I do believe what he was trying to do was he knew that the mob was corrupt and had corrupted so many public officials and so many politicians. So when Hoover didn't want to go after the mob, a lot of people have said, well, it's because the mob had pictures of Hoover in a dress. He was a cross dresser, and they had pictures of him, or they had pictures of him with his second in command, Clyde Tolson. They were gay lovers, and the mob had a lot of evidence about that. I don't believe any of that. I don't believe any of the pictures existed of him either cross-dressing or with Clyde Tolson in any type of risque scene. I believe that Hoover was very intelligent in terms of, if I chase the mob and the money leads to Washington, then what do I do? What do I do when I chase the mob and I find out that they put in governor this and mayor that, or congressman this and senator that? What do I do at that point? Then where do you want me to go with this, Bobby? Do you want me to, this was Hoover's attitude, and I say this in the book. Do you want me to investigate the mob and then find that they funded your brother's campaign to some extent? Do you want me to investigate the mob and tell you all the pictures or evidence I have that your father, Joe, has been meeting with mobsters at the Cal Neva Lodge, which sits on the border of California and Nevada? Do you want me to show you the pictures we have of Joe Kennedy with the mob meeting down there with them? This only goes so far, so I don't really want to touch it. He did not feel they were a threat, the mob. Hoover did not feel they were a threat to national security. And that's why Hoover, I think, the mob was pro-democratic, pro-capitalist. They need the American system to prosper. They needed it. They needed a strict adherence to their individual rights. Without that, I mean, you go to another country that doesn't care about your rights. What is it going to take? 24 hours to round up the whole mob and throw them in a cell? The reason why they were able to get away with so much for so long was because we have strict laws in the United States. You're not allowed to just violate somebody. We have due process. You can't just violate somebody's rights. You can't just lock people up and throw away the key. That's not what America is about. So they loved America, the mob. And a lot of them fought for America. When World War II came around, a lot of them went to war and came back and picked up with their daily activities when they got back, because they loved America. It was the American dream. They were just living it from an underworld point of view.
We do talk a lot about Hoover on this show, but mostly in the 1920s and 30s. But to your point, Hoover was hesitant to go after the mob once it had these close ties to the Kennedy administration. However, Hoover, right, was aware of the mafia's existence pretty early on, but he was preoccupied up to the mid-1930s at least with these Midwest bank robbers who did commit murders, yes, and deserved to be caught and punished for all of their crimes, of course. But they were quite often, products of the Depression, and they acted independently of each other, and they were small fry compared to these large criminal organizations.
Yeah.
Yet Hoover focused on them and ignored, in the 40s and the 50s, what was a growing threat.
He slept on him in the beginning. So I'll tell you what Hoover, it's very interesting. So it's worth a few minutes on him. Hoover was all of the people you mentioned, by the way, Dillinger, Pretty Boy Floyd, all the people he went after, right? Bonnie and Clyde. I don't think he eventually, somebody else, Purvis or whatever but Hoover was behind it all. All the people that you mentioned, all these people rather that he went after, those were headlines. Those were big headlines. FBI looks great, took down another bank robber, but they were all lone bank robbers, lone gunmen, maybe 2, maybe 4 in the gang. Organized crime was something nationwide, a network that spanned across the entire nation from east to west coast. And they moved so fast into industries. As I said, they made a tremendous amount of money during Prohibition. where all of the public officials had their hands out. They bribed all these people. That's how they were able to bootleg to the extent that they did. They had to bribe customs officials. They had to bribe prohibition agents, and they were able to do that. So the mob really once they achieved, they got past the goaltender. If Hoover was tending goal, he was asleep for a couple of minutes when they got past the goaltender. Once they were nationwide and they had all of these public officials that they had bribed during Prohibition, these public officials kept their hands out after Prohibition. What's the next bribe? I'm used to getting $10,000 a month. Now Prohibition's over. I'm not ready to just throw in the towel. Okay, we could use you for this. We could use you for that. We could use you. So they've infiltrated so many cities across the country and all the way up to Washington, that when finally Hoover, and he was not in the dark about the mob, you're right, for years, Bobby thought he was in the dark. Bobby thought he was resisting to acknowledge the mob, but he was well aware of them. He had illegal bugging devices planted in hideouts across the United States after Appalachian, when the mob was caught at this sort of like nationwide gathering of mobsters in Appalachian, New York. He planted all these illegal listening devices in clubs throughout the country. And all of a sudden, he's listening to who's on their take. And he's realizing everything he knew all along. They've got judges. You got Frank Costello gets a phone call in New York. Frank Costello, during World War II, during the 40s, he gets a phone call in New York from a judge who says, "Thank you for giving me my spot on the bench." And Costello's like, "Yeah, no problem. That was, you got to come in. I told you if once it's in the bag, it's in the bag." He goes, "Thank you so much. I greatly appreciate it, Frank. Thanks so much. You got it. Anything you ever need from me, call me back. You got it. Okay, take care." He put a judge a Supreme Court judge in New York on the bench. And then they look into it and they find out that all of Tammany Hall, the machine that controlled New York politics for decades, was controlled by Frank Costello, who was what would become the Genovese family. I mean, the Genovese family's controlling Tammany Hall. And when they went to Tammany Hall to investigate Tammany Hall, they asked the head of Tammany Hall at the time, "Hey, you know anything about Frank Costello, putting in ward leaders?" And the guy said, "I have no idea who you're even talking about." Well, lo and behold, that guy was put in by Costello. He was lying. So Hoover knew this. So, maybe at the very beginning, maybe he might have had an opportunity somewhere, is the beginning of his tenure as head of the Federal Bureau. It was before the FBI, it was called something else. But maybe he had a shot at the very beginning. But once he lost that shot, and all of these public officials and all of these politicians and all of these police captains and police commissioners across the country are in the mob's pocket, that's when Hoover knew, what am I going to do? And he tried to show Bobby in so many different ways that this isn't a fight we want. This is like, and the mob also too, had the mob turned into, I'll tell you something very interesting. Being an historian and a huge, one of my favorite characters from history is obviously and many other people in this country and across the world, Dr. Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. I have a theory that he would not have, if there was any foul play involved in his death, and I was told by somebody that there was, somebody who may have known something, somebody who was in the Colombo family many years ago. I wrote about this in one of my books. I think that what happened was when he's not only for the civil rights movement in America that perturbed Hoover, scared him out of his wits, his control over the entire African-American community at one point, but also too, when he started speaking out, he won a Nobel Peace Prize and started to speak out against the Vietnam War. And I think that's when Hoover felt like he's just going a little too far now. You're a threat to this country and this country's national security and their policies. I think that is what Hoover considered a threat, and the mob never was. So Hoover would consider a bunch of anti-war protesters with long hair and a few homemade signs with crayons way more detrimental to the U.S. security than an entire underworld who wants to live within the boundaries of this system, even if they are breaking the law. And for example, within the boundaries, I should say, even if they are breaking the law, for example, they're not a threat to the institutions. And they understand if a law enforcement agency comes after them and plays fair, they may have to go to jail. That's fine with them. We understand the stakes, and we don't hold that against you. But we're going to try to corrupt you. In the meantime, we will try to corrupt the judge. We will try to corrupt the jury. We will try every means available to us to overcome and win this battle with you. But we understand if in the end we lose and Lucky Luciano has to go away for 50 years, okay, that's life. But we're not a threat to the institutions of America. That's how the mob felt, and that's how Hoover looked at them. So whether it be a handful of anti-war protesters or he was very big on hunting quote-unquote communists, and I put quotes around it because the threat was very, very minimal at the time. I think it was very overblown in Hoover's mind. But it was serious at times, too. They had infiltrated the labor movement to some extent. Labor unions were infiltrated by a number of communists / socialists. And even FDR had Sidney Hillman, who I speak about in Volume 1 of the Borgata trilogy, Rise of Empire. Sidney Hillman was able to sort of get those far left organizations in line and behind Roosevelt, promising them that Roosevelt would be good to labor. And he was able to. So there was like a sort of kind of threat at times, but never as severe as Hoover made it. But Hoover needed to chase somebody. And if he wasn't going to chase the mob, I think he made the demon a bunch of communists. And I think he had to overblow it to make sure that he looked like he was putting people away. He also was very overblown with his chasing of, as you said, these sort of lone criminals. These guys aren't super threats to the United States. They're robbing a bank, getting in a car and doing a high-speed chase on Highway 95 or whatever. That's not a threat to the United States government or the institutions that make up the government. So Hoover was very, very particular in who he would, I think, single out. And I do believe that the mob he did not feel was a threat to America and its security. When World War II happened, let's just go through this really quick, and then we'll wrap that part of it up, if that's okay, Eric.
Sure.
When the mob was asked to secure the waterfront, the Eastern Seaboard during World War II, there was the threat of Nazi sabotage. There was the threat of U-boats cruising in and out of U.S. harbors, and U.S. naval intelligence was terrified that these acts of sabotage and these U-boats would pose a threat to the shipping that was being sent overseas every day to keep the Brits in the fight and to eventually supply the other countries, the allied nations. So they asked the mob, "Hey, can you secure the Eastern Seaboard for us?" Absolutely, we'd be happy to. We believe in America, and we believe in the American dream. And even though we're living it in an underhanded way, we will indeed help secure the Eastern Seaboard. And they did indeed. And there was no sabotage on the Eastern Seaboard after the first incident, which caused U.S. naval intelligence to look for them. The next thing was during Prohibition. The American public needed someone to supply that demand when the U.S. government refused to supply alcohol to them. Now, have you? Alice Roosevelt, Theodore Roosevelt's daughter, she said all of Washington had liquor cabinets. They were all drinking. They were all hypocrites. So the public kind of knew that their own politicians who voted against them having alcohol were drinking. So why couldn't they have it? Well, maybe there would have been more public tension if the mob didn't supply the demand. So were they so bad during Prohibition to supply alcohol? Okay, it's illegal. I get it. Okay, should go to jail if you break the law. I get all that. But when it comes down to it, you're giving alcohol to adults who feel like they're being denied it by their own government. I mean, maybe that's a little bit of a pressure valve for public tension. So these are the things the mob was doing that really everyone didn't see as horrible. And as long as they stayed in their own lane, that's another thing, Eric. People weren't as concerned with the mob as long as they kill each other.
Right.
Just don't get out of your lane. Don't kill a U.S. politician. Don't kill a commissioner of police. And that, again, in Borgata, Rise of Empire, I talk about it. When the mob first got here, it seems they were responsible for the death of a police chief in New Orleans. And the backlash was way more than they ever wanted to ever face again. And it resulted in the lynching of a number of Italians because the public was not going to put up with a bunch of Italians killing their public representatives. You could kill each other. You could kill yourselves. That's fine. Stay in your lane. Don't kill our governors. Don't kill our mayors. Don't kill our public officials, our police commissioners. Those are ours. Even if you help them get into office, whatever. We know they're corrupt. That's okay. Americans know that their government is corrupt now, as you and I speak. I mean, are we that dumb that we don't realize that there's a lot of corruption in the United States government in both parties? Of course there is. Of course there is. What is a lobbyist? I mean, a lobbyist is a well-dressed mobster, right? And a lot of them, maybe not all of them, but a lot of them are. So it exists. Today, I think the public was fine with it as long as they stayed in their lane. And I feel like Hoover felt that as well. I don't feel like Hoover felt threatened by any damaging information that the mob was withholding and threatening to reveal to the public. I don't believe that was his thing. And it's I urge your readers to read I speak about Hoover in depth in volumes 1 and 2. I urge your listeners to pick up both books and get my take, digest my take on Hoover. Don't jump, don't rush to judgment. Digest it, sleep on it, and drop me an email. Let me know what you think, because I feel like I nailed it. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. And I know we have other things to talk about besides Hoover, but he's an important figure in these events. And you mentioned the fact that Hoover didn't believe the mafia was a threat to the establishment. Yet, you make the argument in your book that the mafia took part in the assassination of the President of the United States. And that's the very definition of a threat to the establishment. And Hoover doesn't suddenly, change his tune and vow to take down the mob.
Well, I mean, it's interesting the reason why. So first of all, that is the crucial, that's the big change, the monumental change is the death of President Kennedy. So up until November of 1963, the mob they're not condoning the murder of anybody within the government. Now, during the Kennedy administration, to bring it up to speed, during the Kennedy administration, Bobby's going after them. And if you recall, their liaison was Frank Sinatra, and they had a working relationship in the past with Joe Kennedy Sr. So the mob says, look, let's get to Joe. Tell Joe, look, we were promised certain things. You told us your boys would leave us alone. And they grouped Jack with Bobby because Jack's in the White House. Jack could, they believed, rein him in. And he's not. Jack was too easygoing. So they said, look, let's get to Joe Kennedy and have Joe rein in the boys. And Joe's word had the force of law in the Kennedy family. Every source you'll ever read says that. Basically, the boys were terrified of their father, and they believed that their father sort of was a patriarch in the old sense of a family. So they try to get to Joe Kennedy at some point. And they grab Frank Sinatra and they say, look, Frank, go talk to Joe. Tell Joe to have the boys rein it in. This is absolutely absurd. This was not what we signed on for. We feel like we've been double-crossed. And as Frank is preparing to go visit Joe Sr., Joe goes for a round of golf in Palm Beach, Florida, finishes the round of golf, gets a little lightheaded, and suffers a debilitating stroke. And now he's confined to a wheelchair, can't talk. He's a mess. And the mob just lost the person who made the promises to them. And as author Gore Vidal said, who was related to the Kennedy clan, the Kennedy family, he said, had Joe not suffered that stroke, he would have settled that beef with the mob in 2 minutes. In 2 minutes. So now Joe's out of the picture. I think it was December 61, Joe had the stroke. And he's out of the picture. He's removed from the scene. And Frank Sinatra's now at a crossroads. He said, I don't know what to do. Joe was our guy. Joe would have told the boys to rein it in. They said, well, you're going to have to go see, Bobby then yourself. Go talk to him yourself. And he went to, Sinatra went to speak to Bobby. And Bobby was incensed by Sinatra having the audacity to interfere with the Justice Department. And he not only turned Sinatra away, but he also told his brother that Sinatra's heavily connected with mob bosses across the country and you can't be seen with him anymore. And also then ramped up his investigations into the mob. So it really backfired. The mob now was Bobby was chasing them at 100 miles an hour already. And now he brings it up to 120 miles per hour. I mean, everything he's got, he's incensed that Sinatra interfered, that the mob would have this pull, and that he's going to show them who's boss. And he goes after them even more. And he's subpoenaing wives. He's seizing possessions. He's deporting people. And the mob doesn't know what to do. And that's when all of a sudden there starts to be chatter over the illegal eavesdropping devices that Hoover has planted throughout the country, where mob bosses are saying, he's got to go, Kennedy. And at first there was talk about killing Bobby, Jimmy Hoffa, who was part of the cabal involving Santo Trafficante from Florida, the Don of Florida, and Carlos Marcello, the Don of Louisiana. He says, look, we need to kill Bobby. And then at some point, he was trying to arrange for Bobby's death in Washington, D.C. And the person who told about this, that Hoffa was doing this, took a lie detector test and passed later on. But at some point or another, the mob, the Gulf Coast bosses, decide that if they were to kill Bobby, that Kennedy would send out the military and start just rounding up the mobsters, and things will even be worse. So they knew that they had to then, at some point, they figured, and this is discussed openly, they had to kill Jack, which would automatically disempower Bobby. And how Carlos Marcello said it to a number of individuals who were present, he said, look, if you cut the tail off a dog, the dog will still bite you. This was an old Sicilian saying. He goes, if you don't want to get bit, you cut the head off and the dog dies head and tail together. So meaning if you kill Jack, who's the head, then Bobby, the tail, would be gone in a minute. And that was the talk. So now why? Why is Hoover listening to these bugs and not doing anything about it? To come back to the statement that you said, this is the establishment. They're ready to kill the establishment, right? The biggest man in the American establishment, in the American, all of our institutions. He's the head of it all. Why? Why doesn't Hoover do anything? Well, the explanation for that lies in, once again, Bobby Kennedy. When Bobby became Attorney General, for decades, Hoover went directly to the Oval Office and dealt directly with the president. When Bobby becomes Attorney General, he tells Hoover, you go through me from now on. I'm your boss. The Attorney General sits above the FBI and the FBI director. You go through me. Any correspondence with the Oval Office must pass through me. Also, any FBI publicity releases, public releases, must come through me. I will edit them. I will tell you if they're okay for publication. And Hoover's like, what is this? Is he kidding me? I was head of the FBI when Bobby was born. I mean, I can't believe that I'm going through this right now. And Bobby is relentless. Now, Bobby puts a buzzer on Hoover's desk, and he tells Hoover, you need to run to my office whenever I buzz you. And Hoover's an older man. He's twice Bobby's age. And Bobby starts buzzing him for kicks. At one point or another, Bobby has a friend of his in the office, and he says, I got this buzzer installed for Hoover. He goes, really? The FBI director? You know, Hoover was always thought of as like one of the most powerful men in America, if not the. And he says, you could buzz him he goes, I'll do it right now just for kicks. And he buzzed him, and Hoover comes in red-faced and sweating from running down the corridor to get to Bobby. And he goes, what's the matter, Bobby? And they laugh at him. And this is anathema to Hoover. Hoover can't believe it. Now, Hoover's a straight-laced guy. He believes in dress code. He believes in etiquette. Bobby's walking around the Justice Department with no tie on, his sleeves rolled up, kicks his feet on the desk. He's throwing darts at the wall. He misses the dartboard. The darts are stuck in the plasterboard in the wall. And Hoover's going, what is going on here? So at some point or another, Bobby makes the decision with Jack that if Jack gets a second term, they're going to retire Hoover. They're going to force him into retirement. He's done. Out. Goodbye. Now, Hoover's got secret files on everybody. He's been collecting these derogatory dossiers on senators and congressmen. There weren't many congresswomen at the time, but senators, congressmen. He's collecting these derogatory dossiers, collecting dirt on people so that he could compromise them if need be. He doesn't want to leave. He doesn't want to be thrown out. He's been there through how many presidents at this point? So he feels threatened. And at some point, Bobby goes one step further. And Bobby orders one of his minions at the Justice Department to dig up dirt on Hoover, and he said to smear him as a homosexual. Now, the gay community is very welcomed in America today. It's not the same as it was in the 1960s. But in the 1960s, the gay community had a really, really much harder time then than we could ever imagine today. For the most part, I should say, the gay community is accepted in America. There are a few pockets of people here and there who haven't come around to accepting them. But in the 1960s, the majority of Americans, if you were smeared as a homosexual, and it would be smeared at that time, you were done. You were done. And Bobby, during the McCarthy committee, he chased homosexuals. He wanted to weed them out of the United States government. That was part of his job. And he banged heads with Roy Cohn because of things like that, probably. But whatever the case is, Hoover now is at risk of being not only thrown out of the Bureau, but on his way out, Bobby wants to smear him as a homosexual, something that was entirely institutionally and socially unacceptable in the 1960s. And you have to imagine, as Hoover's listening to these chatter on these illegal bugs talking about Kennedy being killed in November in 63, and he's not doing anything about them. He's not reporting them to the Secret Service. He's not reporting them. He's not sending out his own agents. He's not telling Bobby, his attorney general. He's not telling Jack. He's not making a trip to the Oval Office to explain to the president, gee, I have these bugs installed. I know they're illegal, but I have to tell you what I found. He could have even lied and said it wasn't from an illegal bug. He could have said it's from an FBI source, but he didn't report any of it. And why didn't he report it? I feel some people have accused Hoover of being complicit in the conspiracy to kill Kennedy. I do not believe he was complicit in any way, shape, or form, except having ignored threats to the president, perhaps for want of them to succeed. And that's what I feel. I urge your listeners to buy the books, buy Clash of Titans for specifically with the Kennedy assassination, but get Rise of Empire as well. I go deep into it, and I do not shoot from the hip. Everything is sourced in the back. If you like to look up sources, go at it. Everything's sourced, and that's an opinion I drew from years of research.
Patriotism, though, is putting the country ahead of yourself and your own insecurities and your own pettiness and need for revenge.
He wasn't a patriot in that sense. You're right. Yes, I agree with you. In that sense, he was self-serving. I guess he wore a patriotic hat from 9 to 5, but there was a part of him where he was a self-serving tyrant, and there's no excusing that. He was a tyrant. He collected dirt on all these people. That's a whole nother story about Hoover that I could get into and talk till my mouth is dry. We could go on and on. I have to keep my focus to what's relative to the book, what's relative to the mafia, what's relative to the Kennedys. I felt that, once again, who he chose to attack, I believe he was patriotic in the sense where if you were a threat to the United States institutions, but at that point, the mafia was, as you had said, and I totally agree with you. And why does he allow that to happen? Because of selfish reasons. And people put themselves first all the time. I mean, what's new about that? In the end, somebody could be the biggest patriot in the world, and when it comes down to their own life, their own reputation, when their own ass is on the line, in plain English, they choose themselves. And that always happens time and again throughout history, Eric. I mean, the people we could talk about throughout history who have done that. When Horatio Nelson was killed on the HMS Victory at Trafalgar, they mentioned it. I think Pitt, one of the Pitts was in, Pitt the Elder, Pitt the Younger. I don't remember. It's been a while since I read it. But they said, look, Nelson died on his boat. And he said he finally got what he wanted. He didn't think of it as patriotism. He thought of it as he wants to go down in history as the great man who died during the great battle. So, was Nelson a patriot? Of course he was. Was Nelson self-serving throughout his career? Sure he was. At one point, it was incumbent upon him to turn away from battle. And they handed him a telescope, and they said, the signal's coming from another ship that we need to turn around. And he didn't want to turn around. He wanted to rush into battle. So he took the telescope and he put it to his dead eye. He had lost one of his eyes in battle. and he put it to his dead eye and he says, I don't see the signal, full speed ahead. He was self-serving. He didn't care about his ship or the sailors on it at that point. So there's always this, where you could make life is not easy to explain, obviously, in just one box. People are complex. And I do believe that Hoover was willing for his own survival to throw everybody under the bus. I mean, come on. You got how many years, how many decades in Washington, and all of a sudden you're going to be smeared as something that's unacceptable in 1960s America and thrown out of the bureau and maybe end up in jail where you'd belong. You probably wouldn't get that far, but for the things he was doing, there, just his illegal listening devices were against the Constitution at the time. You weren't allowed to bug people. This wasn't this wasn't in the gray area. He was planting illegal bugging devices. And the FBI agents who did it said, we knew when we were doing it, if we were caught, we would be thrown under the bus because the FBI couldn't admit that we were doing it. So, it's a complex thing with, I hope you understand and your listeners understand the distinction I was making.
Yeah, for sure. So it's been a few years, but I did talk at one point to an author named Gerald Posner, who made the case in his book that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone. And you, of course, have a different opinion on how that happened.
Yeah.
Can you walk us through the evidence? What makes you believe the mob was behind the president's assassination?
Yeah, I believe, I hate to say this, and I don't say this lightly, but he's a very intelligent man and a very thorough writer. I tend to doubt his sincerity when he says that because the evidence is overwhelming that he did not act alone. And let me just give you one example. The magic bullet, the quote unquote magic bullet, was a bullet that was supposedly had gone through Kennedy's neck, turned downward, went inside of Governor Connolly, nicked 2 ribs, punctured a lung, turned upward, exited his chest, hit his wrist, made another turn, bounced off something else, and was discovered on a gurney at the hospital later on, untouched, unblemished, as if it was just purchased from a gun store. When Connolly was asked about that magic bullet, he said, I don't care how many tests you run. I don't care how much evidence you present to me. That did not happen. I'll never believe it. There were a number of men on the Warren Commission who said they did not believe this magic bullet theory. And I'll get to that, how it ties into Oswald. They did not believe the magic bullet theory. When they approached Chief Justice Earl Warren, who the Warren Commission was named for, who headed the Warren Commission, and said, we dissent. He said, no, I need everybody in unison. They said, we don't believe it. It's impossible. Don't try to push this on us. And he said, I need to have this closed. He was getting pressure, obviously, from President Johnson at that time and Director Hoover. I need to have this closed. No, I don't believe it. You have to believe it. At some point, they asked Johnson in private, someone did, all sourced in my book, do you believe that Oswald was the single shooter? He said, no, of course not. This is Johnson, Lyndon Johnson, who was behind Kennedy a couple of cars back. So why was that magic bullet theory put forth during the Warren Commission? Because without it, there was more than one shooter in Dealey Plaza. The bullets rang out too close together, and there were too many shots for Oswald to have fired them all. So they had to make one bullet do a lot of damage. And that's where the magic bullet theory came from. That's the first thing that says that there was at least one more shooter other than Oswald. If Oswald was a shooter, and I'll explain that as well. And the evidence suggests that he may have not been. This is not something I'm making up. If you would have told me this before I started researching this, I would have told you you're dropping acid. What's wrong with you? Don't tell me Oswald didn't do it. Are you out of your mind? I promise you I would have told you that. 77 witnesses, when the shots rang out in Dealey Plaza, ran toward the grassy knoll and believed the shots came from the grassy knoll, where a number of other witnesses did believe that shots came from the school book depository. But all of those witnesses were discounted later. They said, no. One of Kennedy's closest advisors, who wrote a book after the assassination, what's his name? He was considered part of the Irish Mafia. Why does his name slip my mind now? He's throughout my book, and his name slips my mind. Kenny O'Donnell. He says, look, I told the FBI the shots came from the grassy knoll. They told me, no, they didn't. You must be mistaken. He told this to Tip O'Neill later in life, when Tip O'Neill said, why did you testify before the Warren Commission that the shots rang out from the book depository if you told me they came from the grassy knoll? He said, well, when the FBI questioned me, they told me, no, you're not hearing it right. They must have came from behind you. You understand? And he said, so I said, sure, I understand. It's in my book. Look, check the source. This is from Kenny O'Donnell's mouth and from Tip O'Neill. So, I mean, if you want to call them liars, that's fine. But don't call me I'm just the messenger. Also, too, at some point after the assassination, Hoover sent a memo to Katzenbach, who took over for Bobby. Bobby was incapacitated mentally after the assassination. And Katzenbach takes over, and he gets a memo from Hoover. And Hoover said something along the lines of, we need you to put out something immediately that tells the public that we're absolutely confident that Oswald was the real assassin. And I point out that he did not say the lone assassin, but the real assassin. That's interesting that Hoover said the real assassin. And it's interesting that Hoover would even make that request to Katzenbach, who obliged, by the way, and did put that out. Also, too, let me just say this, Eric, and this is the best piece of evidence because no one could dispute it. Any of us who have watched the Zapruder film, first of all, any of us who have seen a high-powered rifle hit something, and then any of us who have watched the Zapruder film knows that there's a little something off. Kennedy's head goes back and to the left. The shot comes from the front. They want to tell you that that's a high-powered rifle hitting him from behind that drove his head back. When someone shoots you, I mean, just go watch a Western movie when a cowboy gets shot. Does he fly towards the guy who just shot him, or does he fly backwards? He flies backwards. I mean, this is like physics 101. And they've been telling us, first of all, they buried the Zapruder film. Henry Luce of, was it Time or Life magazine, purchased the Zapruder film for, I don't know, $250,000 it may have been, and then buried it in a closet somewhere. Why didn't he show the American public? Refused to show the American public. Finally, after Jim Garrison's trial, where Garrison tried to expose that there were co-conspirators involved in the assassination years later, the Zapruder film eventually was shown to a jury and then eventually came out. And then at some point when it comes out, they first tried to alter the film with a couple of different, they tried to clip out a couple of slides and make it look different. They got caught for doing that. And then the real one comes out. And when the real one comes out, they try to tell you that when someone's shot from behind, their head goes towards the bullet. What? Are we idiots? His head, the guts came out of his head and flew backwards and splashed into a motorcycle cop's face. That does not happen from a bullet from behind. Are we idiots as an American public to just nod along and be lied to like that and go, oh, okay, no problem? I mean, come on. And Posner should be, come on. Posner should be better than that. I mean, Posner sees no problem with that? Or is Posner, I don't know who Posner's, I don't know. I don't understand how he missed that. And he missed all of the other things I just said. Also, Hoover he calls up the Secret Service at some point. He says, look, there's somebody impersonating Oswald in Cuba when Oswald was supposedly in Cuba in Mexico City. Oswald was in Mexico City trying to get a Cuban visa. And the guy who was impersonating somebody who was going by Oswald, Hoover says, my agents know who Oswald is and have talked to him and seen him. And they said that they listened to the tapes and they saw the photos, and that's not Oswald. This is coming from Hoover. When Jack Ruby shoots Lee Harvey Oswald in public, Hoover said, well, Oswald was a lone nut, and now Ruby's another lone nut. Okay, we got two lone nuts. Sounds good. We'll accept that as the American public. All good. What does Hoover say in private? Hoover says in private, it's a typical mob hit. He was silencing somebody. It's obvious. Anybody knows that. This is coming from people in the government. So, if we want to just continue to disregard all of that evidence and, continue to pin it on Oswald as the lone shooter, Perhaps he may not even fired a shot. Do I believe Oswald was involved in the conspiracy? 1,000,000%. He had some part in that conspiracy, or they would not have had to shoot him and shut him up. So he was a participant in the conspiracy. I bet anything on it. I bet the farm on it. I bet my life on it. But would I bet my life that he was a single shooter or even the shooter? Definitely not. I wouldn't bet $1 on that. I'd better odds going to buy a scratch off from the gas station.
So would there have been like mafia hitmen stationed in and around the grassy knoll? How would that have happened?
Yeah, the evidence isn't available to me, so I wouldn't write about it in the book. But I guess we could talk about it on an interview where we're more freewheeling. Without evidence, I won't just shoot from the hip. So I refuse to say in the book who the shooters were. I do feel there was one shooter in Dealey Plaza by the name of Eugene Hale Brading, who was caught in the Daltex building, which was a building just adjacent to the book depository with an excellent view of Elm Street and Dealey Plaza. And he was a nefarious character. He was a right-wing extremist with mafia ties. And prior to the assassination, there's talk that Carlos Marcello was putting $1 million on the president's head for anybody who would take it. And he was looking for shooters. And Marcello could pay 6 shooters $1 million apiece. It was pocket change for him. They said that his annual income he grossed over $2 billion a year in Louisiana and Texas, the adjacent state to his, which he controlled both of them. Eugene Hale Brading is picked up in the Daltex building. He's a right-wing extremist with ties to the mafia. Why would right-wing extremists hate Kennedy? Well, Kennedy's stance on civil rights angered a lot of right-wing extremists in the Deep South. And they may have picked up the contract. This is something that may have happened. I allude to it in the book, but I have no concrete evidence other than that he was there mysteriously. He changed his license. He put a different name on his license before he flew there, and he flew there under mysterious circumstances. He gets picked up in Dealey Plaza, and then he flies out of there. It's very interesting to me. So the shot may have been fired from the Daltex building. Who knows? There were also other people seen in other windows in the book depository. Maybe Oswald's role was to let them in, to make sure that they had access to the building. Oswald was sipping a soda in the cafeteria of the book depository on a lower floor, literally like seconds, if not a minute or two after. And the police officer that passed him did not think that he was huffing and puffing as if he had just shot someone and ran down the stairs. So there's some evidence to suggest that Oswald may have not fired a shot. However, I do believe he was crucial to somehow, I should say, and I don't know about crucial, but somehow played a part in the conspiracy. May have been crucial to it, may not have been. There was also sightings of Oswald with Jack Ruby. Some people believe that they saw him with Jack Ruby. A lot of people said that he was with David Ferry. David Ferry was close with Carlos Marcello. And a lot of people saw Lee Harvey Oswald with David Ferry before the assassination. And that was a lot of people who said that's not true. They screamed and yelled at conspiracy theorists for years, decades, and said, "You're idiots, there's no way." And then a picture surfaced of Ferry with Oswald, an earlier picture when Ferry was a little older and Oswald was younger. They were together with the Civil Air Patrol. So it was proven that they did know each other, but other people did say they saw them leading up to the assassination at different training camps in Louisiana, training camps for Cuban exiles. Now, the Cuban exile part of this is a whole different story. Santo Traficante in Florida funded Cuban exiles in Miami, and Carlos Marcello in Louisiana funded the Cuban exiles in Louisiana. And those were the two biggest depositories for militant Cuban exiles in the United States, where they just happened to be the two biggest mob bosses who hated the Kennedys the most and happened to be the chief suspects in any conspiracy. Is that coincidence? Perhaps. I don't believe so. So there may have been Cuban exiles. There may have been right-wing extremists in Dealey Plaza. I don't know. There is no real evidence, hard evidence on who was the shooter. A good mob hit, if it's orchestrated correctly, maybe something like that. You want people to be doing different things. There's moving parts, and you want people to be doing things who don't know each other. So maybe you got a right-wing extremist in the Dow Tex building and a frustrated militant Cuban exile behind the grassy knoll. I don't know. I really don't know. I'm honest, I don't know. However, I do know that whoever did fire the shots, they were acting at the behest of the chief orchestrator of the plot, I believe, as Carlos Marcello, and his Clausewitz, David Ferry. That's something I make the argument strong for. Once again, I urge readers to read the book. There's so much more in there also, too, beyond the Kennedy assassination. I go deep into the Gallo War in Brooklyn. I go deep into Joe Colombo's Italian-American Civil Rights League. I go deep into the Civil War within the Bonanno family. It's mob history, but the Kennedy assassination plays such a big part of it that it's worth talking about.
Yeah, yeah. Now, Bobby wondered right after his brother was killed whether the mob was involved.
Bobby did say a number of. So first, he called John McCone was the head of the CIA at the time. He had relieved Allen Dulles when Allen Dulles was forced to resign under the Kennedys, and Bobby called John McCone. McCone came to visit him at Hickory Hill. Hickory Hill was in McLean, Virginia. It was Bobby's sort of like I guess a rented estate that he and his wife and children lived in at the time while he was AG. And when he got the news that Kennedy was shot in Texas, so McCone shows up and he asked McCone, "Hey, did you guys kill my brother?" That's the first thing he asked. And McCone swears up and down, "We had nothing to do with it." And McCone. It came out later that Richard Helms and William Harvey, two very active CIA bigwigs at the time, said that we did not tell McCone everything that we did. We just thought it was inadvisable to inform McCone, who was the head of the CIA, about everything we were doing. So would McCone know? Probably not, but whatever the case is, he assured Bobby the CIA had nothing to do with it. At some point, Bobby, he's completely mentally incapacitated. He's crying every night. He's not combing or washing his hair or cutting his hair. He's a mess. He's skin and bones. He's got bags under his eyes, and he's a mess because of his brother's death. And a lot of people around him felt that it wasn't just the loss of a brother that he was suffering from. It was more so the guilt of having caused his brother's death. And it was all of the enemies he had created. And I go through each and every one of them who may have had some part in the conspiracy. And also, too, then he would curse the mob. Specifically, he would call it, quote unquote, that guy from New Orleans who was mob boss, Carlos Marcello. And at some point when Jim Garrison opened up his investigation into JFK, many of your listeners will probably know who he is. You have an educated listenership, but those of you who don't, Jim Garrison was the guy sort of that Kevin Costner played in the movie JFK by Oliver Stone. And when he opened up that investigation into him, Bobby was intrigued by it and asked his old friend, Walter Sheridan, who was chief of the Get Hoffa squad, to when he was trying to prosecute Hoffa, he said, "Go down there, look into this." He asked Walter Sheridan and get back to me. I need to know if Marcello was involved or not. Sheridan went down to New Orleans, snooped around, and he was an excellent investigator, Walter Sheridan, for the Justice Department. And he knew how to investigate. And he got back to Bobby and he said, "Look, it looks like he did play a part and he was crucial to the conspiracy." And he went on to begin to explain to him the details he had learned, and Bobby cut him off. And Walter Sheridan felt that he just couldn't take it. It was too much for him to handle at that time, to think that he caused his brother's death by relentlessly going after Marcello, and not only Marcello, but Marcello's immediate family and Marcello's extended family of mobsters. And he pushed Marcello into a corner, and Sheridan felt that Bobby just could not live with that, and sort of like he cut him off and said, "I heard enough." A lot of other people around Bobby went on to say that he believed there was somebody, presidential advisor Dick Goodwin, who said, "Bobby and I talked one night late into the night, and Bobby said, 'Look, we know it was the mafia, and somehow we believe the CIA played a part, but we don't know exactly how those pieces work and who did what, and we may never know.'" And that also came from testimony from someone who was close with Bobby. So there were a number of people around Bobby who did say that Bobby attributed it to the mob on a couple of occasions, the CIA as well, and also the Cuban exiles. What's interesting is he attributed it to the mob. At times he would blurt out something about the CIA or the Cuban exiles, but never once did he say it was Oswald. Take that, Gerald Posner. Bobby Kennedy, Robert F. Kennedy, never said it was Oswald. He thought it was Marcello. He would say those Cuban CUNTSs. That would be the word he would use for them when he blurted out in a fit of anger. They helped, but he never accused Oswald, and that's interesting.
Well, regardless of who was behind the assassination, if the mafia had wanted him dead to relieve some of the pressure, they got what they wanted.
They did.
It was successful.
They did, and I paint a really vivid portrait of that. There were a number of people from the Justice Department who said, chief being Robert G. Blakey, who was the creator of the RICO law, he said, look, whoever the conspirators may have been, it's obvious that the mob had the motive and they got the most out of it. And they did, because Bobby, just as Marcello had said prior to the assassination, if we cut the head off the dog will die head and tail together. And the moment Jack Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, Hoover and his FBI stopped paying attention to Bobby immediately before he even left the AG office. They were done with him. They just shunned him. Johnson couldn't stand Bobby. They had a personal feud of their own that went back to the Democratic primary when Johnson had said some harsh things about the Kennedy family, and Bobby had returned those harsh comments in kind, and they never got along. They hated each other, and Johnson felt like Bobby was out to get him and wanted him off the ticket in 1964. And Bobby began to indict the people who were around Johnson from Texas. Johnson was originally from Texas, obviously, and there were people that he was in business with in Texas who were being indicted, and they were being pressured to provide testimony against Johnson. This is an attorney general going after his own vice president. I mean, this is like, you had, in Hoover's eyes, Hoover had to scratch his head and say, what's wrong with this person? This could metastasize into a full Democratic Party disaster. You're trying to indict people around the vice president as if it's just going to be contained to those people. Bobby's a Democrat. Like, what are you thinking? People had to be scratching their head in Washington going, what is this? What's on this man's mind? But he wants him off the ticket and he hates him, and that's it. He's got to go. So they knew Johnson would get rid of him, and they never got along. So Bobby's gone. And as soon as the shots rang out at Dealey Plaza, he was gone in spirit. And it took another, whatever it might have been, I don't know how many months it took, or a year and eight, however many months, or whatever it took, he was gone, period, and replaced permanently. And that was that. So the mob then ran wild again. Hoover had his job back, and Johnson automatically issued an executive order that said FBI director stays for life. So Hoover's not under threat of anymore of losing his job. So whatever Hoover may have heard on those bugs and did nothing about them, he got what he wanted too, which was nobody's coming after him anymore. Nobody's going to try to smear him as gay. Nobody's going to force him into retirement. Nobody's going to maybe seize his derogatory dossiers on other people in Washington. He's in power again. And Johnson just solidified it. So, I don't believe Hoover had an active role in the conspiracy, but if you want to consider knowing about things that were happening and doing nothing about them, then yes. And that's illegal, by the way. So there is some type of culpability there.
Right. So we've gone a little bit long here. But if you don't mind, I'd like to ask you one more question. We talked about Hoffa at the beginning of this interview. There's been a rumor for years that his body was buried in Giants Stadium.
Oh my gosh.
Which has been completely debunked.
Oh my gosh. So, I've been saying since the first time I heard that, I said, are they out of their minds? The FBI is following leads, like listening to people who tip them to that, and they believe it. I wish I had a direct line. I would have told these guys, what are you, no mob No mobster is going to kill somebody in Michigan and then drive, I don't know, 1,500 miles with the body in the trunk. I mean, yeah, okay, let's get on the highway. And if you see troopers, slow down. When you go through a toll, make sure there's no blood dripping out of the back trunk. Let's try not to get pulled over with Jimmy Hoffa in the trunk. It's not happening. There's no way they transported a body. Usually what the mob does if they're looking to clip somebody, they pre-dig the hole or they know where he's going before time. They don't go, oh, now what do we do with him? Or let's bring him hundreds of miles. If you're killed down on 5th Street, I promise you the hole is by 10th Street or 20th Street. It's not that far away. Or the basement where you're going to be interred in, or they're waiting to pour cement over you in the basement of a warehouse, or they're waiting to backfill a hole before a building gets put up, or in the middle of the woods somewhere. Or what I believe happened is there were some good leads pointing to a mob-controlled sanitation services that had an incinerator on the grounds. And I believe all of the evidence points to Hoffa being taken there. The people who owned the sanitation service were mobsters who were involved in the hit. Hoffa disappears. If you got a high-profile guy like Hoffa, you can't leave him on the street, number one. And if he's going to disappear, he better disappear forever, where they never find a bone, nothing, because they know it's a high-profile target. This is a guy who broke bread with presidents. This is a high-priority mob hit. He's got to disappear forever. And I believe he was incinerated. And then a strange fire incinerated the incinerator following his death. So any clues that might have been there before the feds, came in to look around were destroyed. And that's what I believe happened to Hoffa. Read the book before you draw your own conclusions. Read the book. I put all of the pieces together. I let you know who the conspirators were, why he died, exactly why he died, and who likely did it, and what likely happened to him, as I just said. I believe he was incinerated. And there's no way they brought him to New Jersey. No mobster would risk driving hundreds of miles, or 1,200, 1,500, whatever it is, from Michigan to New York or New Jersey. Could be 800, whatever it is. I never Googled it, Google mapped it, but whatever it is, they're not driving that far with a body. Not happening, Eric. He was disposed of that day in Michigan.
That makes much more sense, yeah. Well, like you said, we've just barely scratched the surface of your book today, and it takes readers up through 1985, right?
Oh, yeah, 80. I trimmed a little off and put it in volume 3, so it brings us up to 1980, and then I pick up in 1980 for the last one, which goes to 2005, which is Autumn of Empire.
Awesome. And again, to remind listeners, your book has just recently been published. It's brand new, January 7th. And there's a lot of info about you and your books at louisferrante.com.
Yeah, that's correct. Thank you, Eric.
Well, thanks again, Lou. Great fun having you on as always.
Likewise, same here. As always, a pleasure.
Again, I've been speaking to Louis Ferrante. His new book is called Borgata, Clash of Titans, A History of the American Mafia, Volume 2. This has been another episode of the Most Notorious Podcast, broadcasting to every dark and cobwebbed corner of the world. I'm Eric Rivenes, and have a safe tomorrow.